Okay, hi everyone. Thanks very much for coming. My name's Dr. Liz Pipe. I'm the Academic Quality and Partnerships Lead here at the London College of Music, which is part of the University of West London. And I'm delighted to be the moderator on this session today, session 2.3, Pedagogy, in all its layered and kaleidoscopic forms. The form that I'd like to really take with this session today is because I think this subject area could have a tendency to be incredibly broad and incredibly deep and incredibly brilliant and messy in its complexity. So I'm keen to kind of try and interweave a narrative that links in with the conference theme as well. But I think for me, what would be super interesting to start with is if I can ask each of the presenters to do sort of a 5-minute summary of their videos, which I hope that you've all watched. I mean, some super fascinating topics within them. And then we'll start some discussions after that. So I'm delighted to introduce Monica to you, first of all, with a fascinating paper, which was Music Teacher Training Needs a Radical Overhaul, and some really, I've made lots of notes, made a brilliant opening question. So Monica, if we give you 5 minutes, if you could introduce your paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Little bit about my background. My original research is in performance, practice and reflective practice. And I'm now working in West London, running a bunch of music teachers for Hounslow. And one of the things that was really worrying me as I took this job over after having been part of the network for 4 years was that it looked like there were rather a lot of music teachers who weren't musicians. And then at the same time, I work in partnership with Roehampton, bringing new entrants into music teaching as a profession, and realised that where music education has gone and what is going on in higher education is in many respects nowhere near what music teachers think they might be trying to teach their trainees. And that began to really worry me and upset me. And I thought, okay, well, we need to look at ways of how do we create the bridges and the links. In fact, I'm very lucky because we've got excellent links between Hounslow and UWL. How do we bridge these links, or how do we create the links between secondary education, music teacher training and higher education, so that actually one of the stated intents of teacher training in general now is that trainee teachers will become teacher researchers. So there's a good reason for being linked to universities as widely as possible, but also to understand that the people coming into music teacher training are nothing like the people who came into it, well, if as old as I should be as a music teacher, but I'm not because I've done lots of other things. If I'd started teaching 40 years ago, what I would have been doing and where I would be now would be completely different from what happened as someone who went into teaching 15 years ago, and even at the Institute of Education got the shock of my life when half the people on the course couldn't read music. I was like, hang on a minute, how can that be true? But then on the other hand, I was just thrown into a whole load of musical practices that I'd never done before. And that was fascinating. And I loved it. And I just thought, right, okay, give me something new every day. That's going to make me so, so happy. And so what has emerged, if you like, in the recruitment process for potential music teachers is that many institutions recognise that they need to be practicing musicians. Hallelujah, that is really, really good news. Let's start with a musician and start with some kind of fascination for awakening the creativity and the joy in making music for the young people in our charge. But there are also some really tricky things to navigate depending on what your musical identity is. So I have a trainee at the moment who arrived in September. She's one of the leading Black female rappers in the country. She lives in the same borough that she's teaching. She has relatives and a big teen following. And the first thing the school said is, we have to delete everything in social media. And if you've watched the video, I interviewed her, and one of the things she said is, I had to destroy my professional musical identity in order to start my pathway as a music trainee teacher. And that to me seems to be absolutely ridiculous. Cruel, in fact. But also the way we teach music in school has got to change. It needs to be flipped. Exactly what was being said before in the performance session. We should be starting with the tech. I've gone halfway because I've got some very resistant colleagues. So we'll do practical first and then transfer to DAW. Actually, I'd like to start it the other way around. That is what they're doing in their bedrooms. And I think we have to look really hard across the whole spectrum of what's going on and the kind of work that Laura Jeffries is doing and things like this, and say, what is it to teach music, either in secondary or higher education? Higher education is moving a lot faster than secondary education. It's stuck in the bloody mud, excuse my French. And that the debate needs to be opened right up that says it's a much broader range of skills. It's not necessarily knowing about Mozart and Tchaikovsky and Messiaen and heaven knows what, although that's all valid, but that in fact my experience with recent trainees is that the need to understand the past, if you like, or the cultural and aesthetic history and value of music comes out of their own practice. So you start with orchestral music as a part of gaming music and then work backwards and say, okay, maybe Wagner was quite cool with some leitmotifs, that's okay. That's where I'm coming from. And I'm hoping you're going to stir up a nice debate.
Thank you so much. I mean, so many questions that I have, but I'm keen to go through all the papers on an overview first, because I think there's a lot of commonality that links them as well. Delighted next to introduce Wells Gordon from Virginia State, whose paper is Examples of Collaborative Cloud-Based Production Pedagogy. So Wells, welcome first of all. If you could give the same, a 5-minute overview of your paper, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Wells Gordon from Virginia State. I'm a coordinator of sound recording technology at the university. And what brought me to this research was noticing maybe about 12 years ago when I was teaching, students had access to really great facilities, API consoles, SSL consoles, and the senior students that were graduating, maybe 1 or 2 out of 5 students would refuse to use the console, and they wanted to use their laptop, and they wanted to do everything in the box. They wanted to do it like a do-it-yourself thing, and I took note of that, and our faculty are scratching their heads going, they don't want to use this $500,000 console, and they don't use all these expensive equipment to do their projects. And when we listened to the work, it was good work, and so I think that kind of started to click something, an idea for me as far as out of the box, and not necessarily teaching in a more of a corporate way, or when I went to school in the 90s, and I went to MTSU, and all of the recording studio labs were modeled after any commercial facility. You had your large consoles, you had all your premium name brand microphones and compressors and EQs, and you were trained so that when you left, you could jump into an internship or jump into a studio and not miss a beat, or at least be competent enough to be able to listen and wrap cables and work your way up, right? And I'm finding over the years, more students are just like, I want to do this myself, my own way. And that kind of led me into a path of doing some other research on online collaboration. Back is 2016?
2016 was when we met, yeah.
Yeah, we decided to do some songwriting using Dropbox and Reaper and things like that. And when I got hired to Virginia State, their program was in shambles. They didn't have a strong leadership in my area, so I spent like 2 or 3 years rewriting the curriculum, and the old curriculum was very, students didn't really get good classes until their junior year, senior, just a couple of years. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to make sure that starting in the freshman year, that they were getting little bits of audio throughout. And then when it came to purchasing and refreshing the facilities, I was in a kind of a state where I'm like, well, do I want to get the consoles and get the brick and mortar model of things? And I went back and forth with friends and colleagues about that, and I made the decision not to. And it was more about, you need to learn signal flow. So patch bays and outboard gear are a must. But I wanted it to be fluid and flexible so that the students that we have come from their socioeconomic backgrounds are, is not so great, and they're first generation students. And I want to make sure it was accessible because a lot of our students love FL Studio and they love hip hop and they like urban music and contemporary gospel music and that kind of stuff. So I really want to tailor my program to the needs of the students. And so I feel like we could pivot in our curriculum to give them not to go, here's Pro Tools and this is Pro Tools and you are going to use Pro Tools and there isn't anything else. I want to try to make it more holistic, an experience for them. They learn Pro Tools, but then they can also learn Reason and they can use FL Studio and Ableton, try to really broaden that accessibility for those students. And then the cloud-based piece, once COVID hit, I was speaking with a lot of colleagues, even here in this room, and actually the woes of online teaching and and software, and how do you teach them about signal flow or mixing and audio online? Well, luckily we'd already been working on that for a couple of years before COVID. So I even in some of my classes that went full online, I had a pretty good foundation for like going, okay, I've got 4 students here. They're all in different parts of the state. They're at home. Let's make music, and now there's trouble because accessibility and the privilege of having the machines. We had issues like that. So, I'd do like, doing things like let's find the best free plugins that there are, and just doing things to navigate it so we could align the playing field as the best we could. I don't know if I'm running into 5 minutes. Is that?
It's great. You can...
Okay. Okay. And so, but I think a lot of what you've been talking about and in your papers really align with my dilemma, which is it's a Bachelor of Music, but our students aren't typically super strong musically. So we also have to address those issues as well. And so how do we teach music and music technology in a way that's relevant and gets them where they want to be, and while still satisfying the college, the university, and the accreditation and all that kind of stuff. So it's a fine line that we walk. So that's basically it. And then in my presentation, I'm talking about this one particular model, Arts Laureate, which is I want to teach our students how to be functional in not only in a studio but also with their laptop, traveling, working in a bedroom, collaborating with people via the web, and being functional, because that's where business models, that's where work is going, is really virtual and not so local, So
it's fascinating about the commonalities between your 2 papers, which at first glance appear quite different, but actually is so much commonality that I'm not going to go into just yet. But another fascinating paper. So just get thinking of some questions. Just put that one out there. You'll have recognised that the lovely Laura isn't able to be here today. Laura's paper, I sort of feel that I don't want to simplify the kind of levels of complexity that were in Laura's paper, but I do want to honour the content somehow through this discussion because, excuse me, she raises some unbelievably important topics. And one of the things about today that I've noticed and perhaps realised is the commonality between the different subject areas that we've been looking at throughout the conference, that actually pedagogy, for example, does not stand in isolation to performance, to cultural entrepreneurship. And we had some really fascinating discussions about gender, particularly in the opening section today, and there's a lot of that, obviously in Laura's paper, but by nature of the topic that she's talking about. Fundamentally, what Laura is presenting, I believe, and please forgive me for the simplistic nature of my explanation, but she's looking at the teaching methods and materials and approaches for acoustic guitar pedagogy in the Ghanaian music education institutions, saying that she's presenting that perhaps they are not suitable for women teachers, and opening up a plethora of really complex and wonderful and layered discussions about cultural values, societal values within, I guess, her particular culture, obviously, for this paper, but actually it opens up so many other thought processes for me. And what she's basically saying is, our teaching methods really cutting it for women? And that really reminded me of the topic that we were, starting to talk about this morning in the very opening session. And, she has undertaken this research that, highlights issues that are faced by women in that particular field, and some really sort of staggering statistics with that. So I'd be keen to integrate as much of that as we can without Laura's expertise and detail as we can to honour her work here today. Not at all to replace Laura, but to to welcome to the panel. Delighted my friend and colleague Dr. Dan Pratt is here. Just to give you a little bit of background explanation, here at LCM we have a record label, an in-house record label called, which is over there.
See the sign
in that
just
room,
over there?
London Noise Records. I won't describe too much about it. It's distributing partner is AWOL, who are obviously part of a huge international conglomerate. Attached to that kind of pedagogic idea is a more outreach-based project called Future Noise, which is what Dan is here to talk to you about today. So if you could give us a quick 5-minute summary of your non-paper, that would be awesome.
Yep, brilliant. Okay, I was well prepared for this. So if you do look across there, there's a little banner. There's a banner up there that says London Noise. That was a 2-year project that myself and Ben Bushell began, where we were just seeing if we could convince a university to partner with a proper record label. So rather than saying we're a university that's essentially doing DistroKid and a website and we call it a record label, we were wondering, well, can we make a commercially viable record label? Took 2 years to actually get a university legal area to get their head around the difference between intellectual property and mechanical property. And we ended up having to hire some very smart music lawyers until we have developed kind of a contract where UWL offers a commercial opportunity for students should they wish to take it that is non-binding, that distributes through a major label through AWOL, which is distributed through Sony. Meaning that we can say that we've released students through Sony, which then develops a lot of problems. So then we became what I would consider to be the dog that caught the car, and had no idea what to do with it, because all of a sudden, once you bring Sony into an institution as sort of a quality control area, the immediate thing you're going to have is, well, your students start thinking, how can I make things more like so that Sony would like it, or how can I get it on the record label so that Sony would like it? And then we even have music management students who run this label going, all right, we need to make sure this is more commercially viable and things like that, which the problem there is all of a sudden a university starts becoming this like production funnel of creating cookie cutter music. So in comes Future Noise, which is a set of loose partnerships that were developed by myself and our wonderful colleague, Dr. Christina Kelman. Christina and I worked in Australia for quite a long time together. In fact, I was her PhD student. And we spent a long time developing a QUT project called Vermilion Records, which was a student-run record label, similar to this, but less constrained with the commercial issues. And we had a whole load of students who were running that, and had gotten to a point where we had created the community of practice that we've been dreaming of for years, which is we don't have to do as much work. And that, to me, is there's this amazing point that we experience with Vermilion Records, and I was also working on a high school version of this called Big Green Records, where the students were doing their own releases, the students were recording each other, the students were developing their own ideas, and then they were releasing it. And we wanted that replicated here, but because we've already got this commercial entity, Future Noise becomes more than just a record label, because we want to stop thinking of these things as record labels, or putting them in boxes that mean that students have to, write a song that's 3 minutes 40, or nowadays 1.5 minutes, because you just write half a song now. But the the idea with Future Noise was to start thinking about much more inclusivity, and it was the thing that we actually wanted to do first, which was everyone gets to release, everyone gets to make their own music, and we pair them together with other students who then help them grow their work, build their artistic world around their work, rather than thinking of it as something that becomes more commercial. And I always almost want to take some of this commercial language out of it and start thinking about, well, what is your art? What is your artistic world? Because these are much more interesting questions, I think, to me. How are you bringing your art out and showing it to the world? And I think these are important questions for students when they're considering their identity, and then when they're considering how they want to portray themselves with more control. Whereas I think the commercial model that has excellent, it's working really well for our management students because they're learning the structures of the industry in a much more hands-on way, but it does constrain to a certain way of thinking. And I don't think, and Future Noise was never meant to be that. So Future Noise has become lots of things. It has become Future Noise Connect, which we've been discussing for quite a while now, where we go out to high schools and I bring student teams in to record students from surrounding colleges and schools here, and they come in and they do days where we just record tons and tons of music for them, and then we help them get released. And our students kind of facilitate this sort of connection with, cynically, with people we'd love to come here.
Yeah, but actually that's so important for them because
Yeah.
they get so excited by it.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's peer-to-peer rather than us oldies kind of coming in and saying,
you don't need another 40-something-year-old white guy telling you what to do. Like, get the students in doing it. So this has been a really kind of successful connection where we're actually starting to push out into the community. On top of that, we use Ealing Project to do community projects. So we bring in artists, filmmakers, fashion designers, and we put on big exhibitions. And the last major one of those we did was last year. And it was fantastic. We had like 200 people from the community come. We didn't even realize that the Ealing community was interested in it. And all of a sudden we had 200 people looking at, we had an artist who was playing flute, reciting poetry with a film behind her. Is really quite sort of watching this magical art happen, watching the students be so excited about putting it on. At the root of all of this is students developing their own communities of practice, coming up with their own ideas, and educators messing it up. We work so hard trying to develop these skills and tell them what to do and tell them how to do these things and teach them how to do these things. But really, we want them to screw up, because if they don't screw up, they're not going to figure out how to fix it. And I think the result of that is suddenly we're starting to create links with the broader community, with the younger students that are, below university level age. And then we're starting to kind of, create new music, new things that are not necessarily attached to, don't even get me started on the India projects. That's another discussion for another day. I think that'll do.
Thanks very much. I have many thoughts and discussions, but I'm very keen to open it up to the floor. First of all, does anybody want Mike? Oh, sorry, Mike. I'm just sorry. Yeah, Mike on the mic.
1 2. So, a question for Monica and Dan. So, Dan, you were talking about how an artist isn't just the music or the lyrics, but it's this 360 not in a cynical industry way. ID
Isn't
and
it funny
brand
that
and
we use the industry terminology?
So it's this aura an artist has
like
created
that. Yeah.
around them, which brand in a non-cynical way. It's included, images are included, logos are included, and also how they behave and what sort of profile they have created. In direct conflict, we have a fantastic black female MC coming in, and it's not just about profiles, is it? It's not about saying my opinions on Twitter. It's about deleting maybe 90% of the ecosystem of what that artist is. So I just don't understand it. So
I guess you have to think of, particularly safeguarding is the thing that drove it. So schools are heavily limited by safeguarding. Even 10 years ago, when I was teaching outside London, if we had a student with a crisis and she would come to me at the end of the day and she'd been making music and she said, I've got nowhere to go, I could just go to a senior member of staff, say, okay, I'm taking Chantal to this place. I'm going to check to see who opens the door. She's going in my car. I'm on my own with her. And then I'll send an email reporting what I've done. You cannot do any of that now. It's completely impossible. So the problem with Saf was that because of her local profile, and because she also turned up the first day, bless her, in full wrapper outfit. So the pink wig, the corset, the leather. Of course, exactly, that's who she is. And the deputy head who's in charge of safeguarding told me to escort her off the site. And I was like, hang on a minute, this is my trainee. I've been Zooming with her all summer, getting her ready for day one. And so she was then banned from the site for 2 weeks. It was discussed at the highest level at Roehampton in the Vice-Chancellor's office about what was going on and why this girl was a danger to herself and to students. And we then said, okay, well, let's do the logical thing. Let's get the disclosure and barring service thing through. So let's get the DBS. That took quite some time. There were links across the family, which, shall we say, culturally in Peckham involve all kinds of things that are completely inappropriate for a school. So that got delayed. And then she eventually turned up. And she'd missed the first 3 or 4 weeks at Roehampton because Roehampton then followed our lead and said, okay, she can't go into the university either. And she really, really struggled. She is a fantastic natural teacher and a fantastic musician. And yes, her safe place is Hamilton and trap and drill and all that kind of stuff. So there was a bit of sort of horror. Oh, well, we're going to do a bit of Beethoven and we're going to do 12-bar blues and things that were outside her sphere of knowledge. But nevertheless, because she picks it up very quickly by watching, I would just say, okay, I teach one, you teach one, then you can do it. And she did that brilliantly. 9 months later, she's completely changed. It's extraordinary for a 25-year-old. She's much more mature. She loves the teaching. She's realised that she is connecting with whole swathes of the school community who want to have a Jamaican in their midst, bubbling and full of enthusiasm and doing things differently in a way that's much more relevant for them. And she's also going back, but in quite a controlled way, to her performing life. And I think what makes me sad about it is if you're my age and you're a classical musician principally and you get a lot of gigs on Facebook, what's out there is so harmless it's not true. It's the most boring stuff in the world. That's not the profile she wants to have, but she's kind of now trying to negotiate the space in between because she can see that to finish, she needs another 2 years after her initial year of teacher training. She's going to have to be able to be herself musically. Absolutely. And of course, all the rap input she puts into lessons or demos that she does, you can see that's her life. It's not an amateur having a go at rap. This is the real thing. And by God, the girls know. And so that is exactly the kind of thing where you say, but surely those are the people who should be teaching music. And it's not the old white dinosaurs. It's anybody and everybody who has a musical voice within our community of whatever ethnicity and gender and all that kind of stuff, because that's where London kids are. We're in an incredibly diverse place, and particularly in the state sector, we have to embrace every single part of that diversity and make it work. And that also goes for neurodiversity.
Yeah. It's I mean, Monica, one of the things that you say, I need to take notes on your paper, it was just super interesting. One of the things that you say are, identity of musician versus identity of educators. And that seems to be an incredibly real example of that. I just wondered what people's thoughts are about, the words that keep coming to me are relatability and, that's the first one. I just wanted actually to open that floor for this discussion. Yes.
That question actually, because I've got a couple of things I wanted to ask Monica, and the first one of those is that as educators, when we can actually use in a sentence the phrase "and half of them couldn't read music," how does that sit with an approach that all are welcome?
It depends how you construct it. So I've been looking increasingly, Goran Fockstadt, who was presenting at the Sempre conference last September, who's been looking at this tech first, practical musicianship
I
second.
also wanted to ask you about that.
If you take it at its most extreme, which is where I really want to go, is start with the tech. The tech is what our students are already doing. They might not know how they're doing it, and they might not want me, as you say, to mess with it. So I like to deconstruct the whole thing and turn them into baby recording engineers and show them why their mobile phones have got horrible microphones in them if you want to record birdsong and other such thing. But also to be really creative with sound and how you use sound and painting with sound and storytelling with sounds, but also in producing backing tracks or in producing a school song, but nothing including loops. Now, there comes a point out of that process where they want to be able to share it in a different way. And that is where we will put the notation back in, but in a very playful kind of way. We're not going to take the associated board theory books, much beloved. Well, I mean, many of us would have been through that as kids. And I still use that with ones that need it at GCSE. And we've had an A-level student this year who's just finishing who came to us with no theory at all. It can be done, but it needs to be put in the right place where it is an enabler and a motivating factor rather than notation comes first. And if you continue to use that model of tech first, then the practical, it's exactly what was said this morning. You need the skills because you want to perform it. So your track alone in a school concert, okay, we could do a concert of here are all the cool tracks we've made, but that's not what they want to do. They want to perform to each other. And I totally love the fact that then orally, you can go from very messy, badly tuned guitars and not really understanding what's going on to actually very committed performances, because what you're then doing is, or at least with my other hat on, I'm enabling them orally to start to use critical listening skills and to use reflective practice to understand what that band rehearsal process is about, so that they can progress more effectively. Yes, they're going to noodle for hours as well, but that's really important because the noodling often produces the ideas. Yeah.
Sorry, again.
So I teach composition and arranging BMAs down the road at ICMP. So I'm perhaps looking after the students who come on to us in this situation. And yes, many of them don't read music. And yes, I'm probably the only module now that really does enforce scoring of the composition that's been made, and they're glad for it. But I think it's just the idea that actually being able to read notation and play from notation might have to be the basis for music making, that idea should be put forward. And I just wanted to say about the DAW first thing, is that I'm noticing post-pandemic many mental health issues amongst my students from the isolation of being alone making music. And what they really want to do right now is to get in a room with each other and to share a vibration. And so I think a DAW, I use one myself. I'm also a composer and commercial music writer. And I can have some very beautiful happy hours on my own with my computer. But it's definitely, my approach is that I am using it as a tool to assist me to communicate with other musicians, as you're saying. And I advocate actually asynchronous, side by side. So rather than, I suppose my question is, why does one have to come first?
I think what we're trying to do is to tap into the fact that lots of them have got Fruity Loops and GarageBand on their phones and stuff like that. We then put them on BandLab, but they're always working in pairs or threes. And if they're outside the classroom, they're already collaborating. We don't have to do anything about that, because as soon as they get excited, they'll come back the following week and what they're showing is something completely different.
And they're recording each other, right?
Yeah,
So
and
they're
they're
not
WhatsApping to
necessarily
discuss it, and they'll FaceTime each other and go, listen, I've just rewritten these lyrics, who's got the quiet, and then it becomes, it's where you are, and it's back to Wi-Fi and kit. Who's got the quieter bedroom? Can you record the song?
Sorry, no, please.
The funny thing is for what I'm trying to do is, as those young people are going through and finally getting to me, they have a variety of skill sets, and I have some students that are very prolific in composing or producing or whatever. And then now I got to figure out, well, okay, let's figure out how the industry works so that we can get them to the right places once they've had those experiences. So that organizational management, that's why even with the cloud-based production, it's like, let's figure out how to communicate, how to organize file management and those processes, so it's a little bit more organized, because they're probably winging it. They're kind of improvising.
Actually, no, I'm an absolute meanie, because I make them do full event logs.
Oh, well, there you go.
And they hate it. And I go, why?
Uh.
And it's because, it's always, you fall under the proverbial bus.
Yeah.
But I said, if your event log is really, really good and you lose this, I could actually recreate it.
Moving from... Sorry.
Yep. No, I'm just going to come in because I think it's opening up into a discussion, I think, which is, and I'm sort of going to encourage it to go that way, actually. It's almost twofold from the comments that we've had so far. One for me is about identity, quote, it's all under that heading for me, but identity about the musical styles, contents, skills that are being taught at potentially at secondary school, leading in, and how we bridge that gap into higher education. And I'm going to just keep it under identity. I mean, the whole topic of does a musician at higher education need to be able to read and write music now is another very layered concept that I have my own opinions on, and I'm sure is going to get there. But it's almost twofold. One for me is the identity of the actual content. The other is this identity of the teacher, and this word of relatability that just keeps coming back in my mind about all three papers, actually, on different levels, and about how to avoid a disconnect, and what relatability means in those two contexts. And Veronica's had her hand up next time, so I'm just going to come to her first. But I think there's something for me which I think is really interesting to explore about the identity of the curriculum and the musical concepts and the necessity for particular skills in 2023. And the other is the identity of the teacher, potentially, and how that relates to the content of what's being taught, and what it is actually that students need. Veronica, I'm going to come to you.
Wells. Sorry.
So I'm going to come to Veronica first.
Okay. I kind of sparked when you said the relatability, and when I heard the term musician, but the identity of the teacher falls into that as well, because we all kind of felt this, yes, the teacher should be a musician in whatever role we are, whether that is in school, university, whatever. But a lot of the times in my research, I've felt that musician, the term itself, is used in lots of ways of gatekeeping. So it's okay if you're a record collector, if you're a musician as well, because it serves a purpose then. But if you say, no, I'm not a musician, then the record collecting is bad and it's stockpiling and it's the worst case of consumerism you've seen. And I think this ties a little bit into Laura's paper as well, of that particularly impacts on women and non-binary people, because they tend to be much more hesitant to use those terms for themselves. Again, for myself, I play guitar, but I don't term myself as a musician. And the female record collectors, they don't want to call themselves record collectors because they feel like they're a fraud. So there's this kind of, how do we make things happen and feel like these terms can be owned and used in ways that works for as many people as possible?
Can we discard them entirely and not worry about it easily, obviously? I would just knock it all away. It's kind of one of the things I wanted to bring in with Wells is like thinking about, we use these other words as well, like studios, or which are really just sort of constructions that have their own historical imprints and then have their own way of directing work. And I think almost getting a bit Foucault here, that we're just dropping into these cages that formulate the way we think, and we move from one cage to another cage. And when we're in one of these academic institutions, there are these sort of reflections of the historical, quite misogynistic practices that happen within recording practice, which is why I'm all of a sudden quite interested in things like the Arts Laureate model, where we stop thinking of the recording studio as a space that is bricks and mortar, and we start thinking of recording as a thing we do anywhere, and that it shouldn't be tied to these processes. And once we if we make a slight effort to try and discard some of these labels, hopefully it helps. And hopefully then we bring more people in, because we stop saying, because I think this morning there was a lot of discussion of grumpy old producers saying people just aren't as good as me. And I was thinking, at being in this room that is an outdated model, and then thinking about how I can have control over things, which is what it feels like to me. Whereas the way I've always thought about working is let the students run it, let them do the things, let them make the mistakes, let them find their way of doing it, and stop thinking about. Because I do remember when we were talking at Berkeley in 2019, and we've just done this. Oh, someone was doing saxophone in. The idea was a recording studio the way we think of a recording studio becomes, imagine a hallway, and you open one door and there's a bass player in that room, and then you walk down the hallway, and it's sort of metaphorical hallway, because the bass player in this case was in Virginia, the drummer was in Kentucky, the flute player was in North Carolina, and the guitarist singer, me, was in Australia. And the result is there are sort of all these things where people have built up what they like, the workflow that they love, the workflow that they do. And if you take that workflow away, move them into a studio, it's not their workflow anymore. It's this historical building that pushes your workflow into a particular way. Whereas if you keep those things at home and then use transnational kind of non-continuous work, where you're just sort of bouncing ideas off each other and saving them onto something like Dropbox, then what you're doing is saying, how do you speak when you are in your environment that you've designed to best represent your voice? And why isn't that a studio? Because I think that's...
So I'm going to come in. Andrew has been waiting patiently. I have a few things to say, and then I'm going to pass over here. I think let's just keep it moving round to this kind of pedagogic aspect of all of these skills, because I think that has to be at the heart of what we are discussing. And I think we're all in agreement about the importance of real world skills. I think everybody in this room would say, of course we need to know this. The challenge potentially, I mean, Monica, I've written down a couple of quotes that your interviewee said. One was, needing to engage with what the students want to learn musically, and bridging the gap between theory, whatever theory is, and individual experience. And how do we then do that when we are in the slightly, and it's less maybe so in higher education, but we are within the confines of a certificated formalized learning environment. This, popular musicians, as we all know, inherently come from an informal learning background where, and we positively encourage that. We positively should encourage, the non-music reading brilliant musician who, for a variety of reasons, may not have had access as well to that type of music learning. But I think we're all in agreement about real world skill, but I think what I'm interested in is, well, how do we then do that? How do we then bridge the gap between secondary education and higher education, about letting students have some sense of freedom, which I don't, this very sort of constructivist approach about
this is
about
constructive
the teacher
freedom, yeah.
being the facilitator and the, being involved in the construct of knowledge, but within a formalized learning environment. So Andrew, I'm going to come to you.
So this comes back actually to what Wells was talking about when he was thinking about why he would design the studio a particular way. It brings back a memory of like walking through Metropolis Studios, Metropolis C. You've got a very famous, well-known producer engineer sat at the knee VR, channels 1 and 2 up, pan left, right, speakers, using his laptop. Really loud, but he was, that was the workflow because it's what he's comfortable with. And I think it's interesting because one of the things you said was as well that actually the economic background, social backgrounds, etc., mean that students want to do it their way on their laptop. And you're talking about sort of DAW first versus, some kind of mixed approach. But it's interesting, isn't it, that sort of the students they want to do it this way, but is the reason they want to do it this way because that's what they've had access to previously, and that's the ceiling that they perceive that they are going to be subject to. So I think there's an interesting sort of counter argument when it comes to opportunity. That's something I quite like to, when I'm thinking about these things, and I think about this a lot, think about the fact that I would like any of my students to be able to take advantage of any situation in which they find themselves. And it's that challenge between seeing something as being accessible and inaccessible versus going, well, actually, what does this afford? And this is where I think workflow study becomes really interesting in understanding when you go through a particular workflow, it lets you do a particular thing that you may then just be able to replicate. I can, as somebody who grew up, like, you were saying earlier about growing up on an SL4000, I can, the same, grew up on a 4000, the automation system I love, etc. But actually, I feel like I can get there with a plugin in terms of replicating that sound world and be comfortable because it's familiar to me or whatever. But my students don't have that. And in fact, they're not even, it's not what they lust after. Some of them do have, there's this weird thing where you have a student who may well be nostalgic for tape, having never seen it. Yet they have the nostalgia for it.
You can tell who didn't work on tape.
Yeah, exactly. Because anyone who did work on tape knows that
it's a pain in the ass.
2 hours of every 8 hours is spent rewinding, which at £1,000 a day is really expensive. So, but and every time you rewind, it sounds worse. But there's all these things that they don't necessarily know about. But for me, I think to myself, well, actually, sometimes there is that. Aren't we privileged to be able to show students what it was like historically, make them aware of the problems, make them aware of the gender issues that have lived in music technology for us since it started, and to show them, well, actually, you know what, if you understand what it might afford, then you can choose to use it or not. And I do sometimes think that we can not that this is what you've done, because actually I'm totally in agree with the approach. I think it's a great approach, but I do sometimes think that just an awareness of why you might work a particular way, and the fact that somebody still wants to work that way because that's just how they work. But what about that workflow led them to that sound? And can you get to that sound with a different workflow? Well, actually, what's your sound? And about people finding their own personal journey, which I think translates into all of the things we've been talking about today in many ways. But then it's like, is it a problem that we are potentially offering an opportunity that's not accessible because it harks back to an older way of working? But if we're doing it in a way that's understanding what it affords, rather than trying to actually sort of big up this elitist and sort of self-supporting historical approach of things, but coming at it from a different angle. So I still find that there is value in showing somebody how it was, but doesn't need to still be, but why it worked and how it could still work again, but in a different way. Now it's your turn to express yourself in your way through either these old tools or these new tools, or a weird hybrid of all of them that we haven't thought about. I don't know. That's just a starting point.
Try to think of it as this place is your experimental kitchen. There are traditional ways of using it. There are non-traditional ways of using it. And how can you cook something new with these tools? This is how we'd normally use them, but, abuse them. Well, not too much, because don't plug a line level into a mic preamp, please. Or, but this thing will create smoke. That's probably not a great idea. Or this microphone might sound a little hard to everyone's ears. I don't really want to put a C12 on top of a cymbal.
Modern music, often, I think a lot of modern production sounds the way it sounds because we can hit a virtual tape machine with a level you could never hit a real one with.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of creative abuse that is positive, but I still think to make the most of it, you kind of have to understand it.
So how do we, Amandine, I'm going to come to you in 2 seconds. How do we do that at secondary school in areas that are socially deprived? That this is the reality of, I think, Monica, we're talking about the state school. I mean, okay, we're talking about the state school system, potentially in London in 2023, right here, a particular thing. But, in order to bridge that gap into higher education, when there are resources and when there is funding and money in other types of schools, that's one issue. Where we have this sort of luxury of experimentation and choice. How do we do that? How is that possible? Is it possible? I don't know. Yes, I think it is. I don't know. I need to think about it. But how do we bridge that disconnect when you've got students from economically deprived areas who don't have access to that? How do we engage them in a subject where arts funding is being cut in schools? And how do we you know, when the very essence of perhaps things that they might be interested in related to, i.e. the teacher, is then being taken, that whole identity, I don't know, it's so layered and complex that actually, how do we then open that up to students who want a certain thing but aren't in that position to be able to do it? Amandine, I'm going to come to you because I think you have a point to make.
Well, it's actually really building on what Andrew was saying.
Great.
It's a question could be a question of the three of you, but I guess the project that is closer to my area, which is sound engineering, the two projects are in higher education. But I was interested in how if you have moderated the, let's say, social biases, gender discrimination, including in your real life projects. For instance, in your project, which I found really interesting, I really loved the approach, and it reminded me of teaching in North America, which was cool in that sense. It was like building classes as a real life thing or whatever. But I could see, and all those things about communication and Slack, about how to do things, I'm like, oh, that must have brought up so much mansplaining. I mean, you know, for teaching every day in audio schools, where the main comment or complaint I get from female students is like, oh, I got mansplained again, well, how to put my microphone. All right, so how did you moderate that in, I guess, those two projects? In the comments on the social media or inside the label structure?
That's an excellent question. Wells, I'll come to you first.
I haven't really had any conversations about that, so I'm apologize.
Wells, could you use your mic?
Oh yeah, I don't think I've really had those conversations actually. So.
And how many female students, non-binary students, did you have?
I would say, out of 25, 30 students, we probably have 6 or 7.
Okay, well, you're above the average, so you know it's above the average. But you haven't, nobody mentioned anything, or you haven't looked at how maybe they get replied to their question, or if they did ask question, because a lot of the female students in audio schools will tell you that they don't ask questions because they always lead to some bullying, discrimination, laugh, you know.
The students I have are great, fantastic. There's never been any issues that I've been aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And even in Arts Laureate, half the team are women, and we work really well together. And so I don't really see that.
So you mean that the two models, like Art Laureates and engineers, they have women in the...
In Arts Laureate, yes,
okay.
Absolutely. Engineers, I'm holding off on, but just the business model is I'll hopefully in another paper I will dive into that a little bit more. But Arts Laureate I contract with them, so I work with those folks daily or weekly.
Oh, but that's super interesting because they must have, if they are woman engineer working on the thing, they must have found a way to contour some of the issues. So that would be really interesting to see how the structure of the social media communication mods is, like, you know, how they manipulated it so it doesn't
But I would also say that actually I'm lucky I work in a single-sex school. So there's nothing odd about girls doing tech. And in fact, I'm pushing them really hard because when we have open evenings and stuff, there'll be plenty of dads who come in who are in the business, right? And they go, oh, shit, you've got all this stuff. And it's great, it's fantastic. And then I go, and the whole point here is the girls are running it all. Because there's no perceived, oh, this is for the boys, and therefore it comes the same with bass, guitar, drums, all of that stuff.
Through Sarah McGuinness, we have a female-only production group as well, because I had a lot of female students just getting very tired of plugging something in and then having a guy walk up, unplug it and go, oh, you were right, and then plugging it back in. Fair.
And still, you're right, is a good improvement. Like, you know.
The big difficulty was they came and asked me, and I said no, I'll get Sarah to run it, because what's the point in having an all-female group with a 45-year-old man telling you what to do? That's not going to improve the situation the slightest.
And for me, especially starting in January of this year, I was chair of a mass communications for about 2 years during COVID, and then I got transitioned to the music department. And my agreement with Arts Laureate was I didn't have time to mix or do any post. I would go on location, record, I would upload the stuff, and then they would disseminate, they would process all of that stuff. And in January, I started to go, I have time now, I can start mixing and doing some post stuff. And I was trained by Laura, and she because I was using Samplitude, which I'm a Pro Tools and Reaper user. So they require that you use Samplitude. And so if it wasn't for Laura, I would be in a lot of trouble because we, like if we mix and we post, we always do an audio review, which means you mix it, you post it, and someone needs to go back and listen to it and look at it, maybe do some adjustments or suggestions. And she's doing some of that right now. I'm like getting some texts from Laura about my mix. So we just go back and forth, and sometimes I'll do that for her. So this is a very unique situation maybe.
But it's the new models that are coming through, which offer a little bit of hope in that as well, in that because it's spreading out the access. And what I love about this is there's a small office in New York with Arts Laureate, but it's all around America, and everything is done online. There is no office space.
She's in New Jersey.
No studio space.
Yeah, and she has a DMA in clarinet performance, but she's pivoted and learning about cameras and learning about the audio stuff, and I am too. We're all kind of learning. It's a kind of a nutty thing.
It's not just that. One of the things. Would I jump into another one as well? There's male, female, binary as well. We're not just talking about men and women. We're talking about trans women, trans men. We're talking about people who are generally pushed out. I think, and another one for me, which I think is almost a really important binary that gets missed a lot, which is extrovert and introvert. In that introverted people tend to stand back while the extroverts stick their hands on everything. And I always find one of the missions when I teach is to say, all right, who wants to touch the console? And all the extroverts will walk up, start touching the console. And I say, right, cool, stand back. Everyone who stood back, you're here, you're first. You're the important one. And then I tend to find there are people who are more competent or who've done a bit more of it, so they're a bit ahead of everyone else. So then I tend to find a really beneficial that I pair experienced students up with less experienced students to work together and help each other out. But it's like anything. And then I have a female student come up to me and saying, like, my two male co-group were mansplaining to me for the whole session, and I'm like, oh, come on.
And Arts Laureate also has a Mac, and he's, he transitioned last year, but I've been working with Mac for 2 years now. Met him as a senior in college as sound recording technology, and of course now he's hired and working full time. So it's a very diverse crew of folks that work there. But your questions are really important.
No, it's great. I mean, it's the kind of thing I'm really interested in. Also, if the model is built with a lot of women, or especially women, that means they probably, maybe unconsciously, but there's something in it that probably avoids some of the usual type thing. I mean, it's just like course evaluation of all those things. When I got in charge of like updating it, there are a lot of questions that disappear, and other questions that got developed differently because this question is going to target that kind of answers. You know what I mean? So it's like if it's a woman in charge, usually they find a way to kind of not get the result that they don't want.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, right? It's just. But I just I was like, when I was writing your talk, I was like, all right, it's just mostly about the moments where people will post like, how do I do this or how do I do that? But it would be very interesting to see if there's anything, not just gender. I fully agree that it could be seen from different perspectives, but about the way people ask the question, who feel like they can ask the question, or what kind of question they ask, or that kind of thing.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much. Agata's had her hand up very patiently, so I'm going to come to her next.
Thank you very much. I would like to go back to the kind of teacher's identity, and I absolutely agree with everything that was said about the importance of being a practitioner and being a musician when engaging with teaching music. I would like to ask about something going slightly radically in the other direction. So very often in higher education, we have students who want to study with people who are famous performers, just because there's the prestige attached to I studied with so-and-so. And as we all know very well, the fact that someone is a brilliant performer and has a career in performance doesn't mean that they will be necessarily a good teacher. So as we not require from instrumental teachers at the higher educational level any teaching qualifications at this moment, as far as I know, on all the major colleges, what is there to protect us from creating this environment filled with famous names of some of whom are unfortunately bad
Useless
teachers.
That is an
Yeah.
excellent question. Excellent.
I mean, at Liverpool, we had a kind of flip model because the two of us who were teaching performance were practitioners first and foremost. And in my case, I'm a multi-instrumentalist and multi-genre, which is really helpful when you have, even if you're teaching on a classical music course, what happens? They go off and they're in bands, they've started a jazz group. You know, you cannot be this monoculture person who says, darling, if you don't do your fingering perfectly like this. But I think it's very much about institutional style. The conservatoires are, in my experience, and I've worked alongside many of their colleagues, in the same way that this was a debate I'm having with one of my ex-students in some sound installations we're doing together. If you come from the place that you can't do a sound installation until you're a postgraduate, you've kind of missed the point about how certain kinds of installations are completely accessible and are accessible to all different kinds of people, musicians and not, but at the same point of entry. Now, for me, that is about how authentic the approach is. So maybe what I'm saying about if you're going to teach performance is that you are authentic in your own practice as a performer and your students understand that, then also it's actually, a lot of it is the storytelling, but it's not in class, it's the storytelling in the pub. This is what happened to me when. These are the things that happens with that. This is the effect of recording with the deck of four. This is why Papano is perhaps not the easiest person to work with, as I heard from many of my friends at the Royal Opera House. And that actually, for me, and it's the way I've learnt continuously since I was 5, is it's the lived and shared experience that's presented in a way that is authentic, that has some weight, some proper lived experience. It's that embodied thing again. That means that for me, I'm always learning, that's what I want to learn from. It's like, tell me more. So what happened next? And, you know.
There's also an internalized identity I have found in academics. I'm just going to, when I talk about academics, I'm not talking about secondary school teachers at the moment, but Monica will be able to tell me if the same happens here. So I did a paper a few years ago at a conference talking about bridging the gap between, trying to bridge the gap between basically being a practitioner and being an academic. And academics also have an identity crisis because, and when I say academics, I mean teachers in higher education. So we here are very practice-based in our courses, but underpinned with academic rigor. And I can say that with certainty because I'm the academic quality lead, so it's part of my role to make sure that is done. But I've definitely had situations where I have worked with tutors at higher education level who categorize themselves as either a practitioner or an academic. And the narrative that creates for students is really detrimental because they then have a narrative, the students then have the narrative that because the teacher has got this identity complex about, I'm a practitioner, I'm not an academic.
Well,
if you want to learn how to do it, you come to me.
Yeah.
If you want, you know, what about this bridging the gap and being an academic practitioner? You know, being somebody who is academically, you know, and having that. And I'm very aware of the negative repercussions that has on our students who really then associate X with this, Y with this, and actually this is the person I go to for this is the person I go to for this, and actually we have a responsibility, I believe, as educators to ensure that narrative, that there is not a disconnect, because so the identity thing happens at so many levels, you know, musical genre, musical style, background, but also in HE, am I an academic or am I a practitioner? Shouldn't we actually be both? Just a thought, Dan?
How many people here run some sort of program in music technology where you have a little bit of influence or a large amount of influence on who gets on recommendations for hiring? How many of you have had an old, usually male mix engineer come up to you and say, yeah, I could do some lecturing for you? Oh my God. I will give your students real life. Yeah, I'll show them how it is, don't you worry.
But the pedagogic, Dan's totally right. The pedagogic implication of that is this person will tell you how it really is.
Well,
And this person will tell you what it says in the book.
because I was going to say there's a part of that split personality of the academic, which we're also administrators. We're also people who mark assessment. And I think there's this weird perception of us as we're practitioners, we're administrators, we're running courses, we're managing people, we're trying to get students to work together, and we're trying to build communities all the time. And these are the things that we're constantly thinking about. And it frustrates the hell out of me that someone from the industry goes, oh, this is easy. You just walk in and you talk about stories about your life.
Yeah, but I mean, but then you look at,
That's not to say they can't be.
Monica?
Amazing teachers.
No, I mean, I was a mentor for the Higher Education Academy when I was at Liverpool and got some really interesting people to mentor because they were never musicians, and I was told he's a very, very important professor of physics and you're going to meet him twice to go through his portfolio. And I'm known for being very direct in that kind of situation. And they said, can you be very polite, please? And I just looked at it and I kind of went, this is, dear Professor X, it's utterly fascinating research. And of course, I don't understand a word of it, but I'm trying to find evidence for pedagogy here.
Yeah.
And there is none. And we all know, anecdotally, very much from when I was at Liverpool, that there are some academics who can teach or who can share and do things that are marvellous. And there are some who have absolutely zero interest in their students because they're driven by the ref and they don't care about the TEF bit of it. And so in a sense, the institution also reinforces part of that paradox. And depending on the culture, particularly Russell Group University, if you're trying to sit on your laurels and say, I want the best professors who are famous.
Yes.
But they might be absolutely useless and the students all hate them.
Right, right, exactly. I'm going to come to this lady at the back. She's been waiting very patiently.
Thank you. Yes, I was going to say that for me, being a cellist as well as an educator, that it actually could perhaps start much earlier. With instrumental tuition, generally the teacher lets the student know whether they're playing the piece correctly or not, or if it's music production, whether they like the piece or not, or whether they put it together well or not. And we don't often alert our students that they are continual researchers, whether or not they're taking a degree or a PhD, that in people who are playing in the BBC Symphony Orchestra or in a rock band are continually researching the background of what they're playing and finding out about what they're playing because they want to give it meaning. And whenever we have instrumental teaching that is dependent on getting a seal of approval from the teacher rather than allowing the student to understand that they are in charge of their own occupation with this and fascination, then we will have students arriving in universities who are taught by people who don't know that they're researching. I'm very glad to say that down at ICMP we have a very healthy research atmosphere, and I think all the instrumental teachers there are aware that they are researchers and practitioners, and the university itself has a continuing professional development thing going on where we talk about our research, even if we're not doing official research. So my colleague here has a word for it, which is a pracademic. So I think it starts very early on, actually.
I would definitely agree. And it's about reframing that narrative to the students as well. Andrew was next.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think going back to the sort of institutional problems and one of the questions you posed, and actually from, I suppose, the red brick or sort of wanting to be on that trajectory type institution, where there's almost an argument put forward, and I've seen this argument put forward recently, that academics should not be practitioners, and practitioners are data generators that we analyse, and so that is also very prominent.
Scale.
And again, it also depends on where you sit. So again, you will see different performance from, and this is something I mentioned earlier to Simon, that it depends on which unit of assessment you're eventually going to be assessed in. Because if you go into a music department, practice-led, practice as research is given enormous importance, and in an engineering department, it's unclassifiable. It's not considered classifiable as research because actually, is it bringing in funding that is showing industry the way forward? Are we making faster trains? Are we, is there an efficiency saving? Are we, there's completely different set of judgments. And I think one of the challenges, and again, I think this keeps coming up, is how multidisciplinary we are. And it's really interesting for me hearing Wells talk about his program and actually the way things work in America, where actually you might do all sorts of combined studies. I went with Simon a few years ago, and we did a little lecture tour before ARP in Philadelphia, including going into we did a lecture at Harvard. It was really strange doing this lecture to students who were doing some kind of combined arts sort of program, and they were the most dedicated, knowledgeable bunch of students because they saw themselves as active researchers, and they came to that session fully prepared and expectant, to make the most of that situation. And I think in the UK we're in a funny spot at the moment with all of this sort of compartmentalized approaches, very that swing vastly different directions, and I'm not sure any of them are quite right. And it's been really interesting hearing these discussions today. Well, surely this is the right. But then, actually, if you're a practitioner, you can't. There's no way you could be an academic, and if you're an academic, there's no way you can be a practitioner. And then, actually, should we be doing both? And I think I really hope. I'd love to see this sort of debate taking place at a sort of higher multidisciplinary level that looks even further beyond. Because I just feel like I'm learning so much from everyone's comments and approaches, and even actually internationally, it's so different. I think that's one thing I picked up from your video, and also from what you said today, is just that the whole attitude to learning seems very different. But I don't know whether there's then a different attitude to research as well, and that's something that hasn't yet, I don't think, come out in these discussions. And are we internationally what the role of the academic is,
or are we proving we're lecturing?
Well,
are we filling out the forms that say we did the lecture? Because I think that's each to our own mindset. But I have noticed, being an Australian in a UK institution, there's a lot of performative paperwork, and there's a lot of things that are filed under never to be read again, which maybe might hinder a lot of these. We make these creative discussions, and then someone will go, okay, cool, write a 50-point plan on that, and we'll file that. No one will ever read it.
Yeah, so I'm looking thoughtful, not
sorry,
no, thoughtful in and I discuss this a lot with colleagues here, but also externally, about training versus education, and what it is vocationally that we're looking for as well. I'm going to go to this lady here because she's had her hand up patiently and is clutching the mic in anticipation.
Yeah, I've written down some things. So much came to mind, by the way. Thank you. I'm really enjoying this discussion. I think I've definitely had that identity crisis. There's definitely something to it, and I think there's a bunch of really unhelpful assumptions that fuel that. And I think the first thing is making it as a musician. I think there's sometimes, I don't know if anyone else has come across this thing of oh, this person's a lecturer because they haven't really made it as a musician, but they're still kind of trying.
Good for you. Still kind of trying.
Which is just awful, right? And then it's almost like you're kind of ashamed to say that you're a lecturer, because does it mean, what? Oh my God, she can't earn enough money from her music. It's that. And then I think there's an aspect of ageism as well. Where it's this person is already a lecturer, they're too old to be a musician. So that's another thing that really bothers me. It's all coming out now, isn't it?
I didn't realize this would turn into a
therapy for a
therapy session.
Yeah. I think another thing that came up as well, which I suppose can happen, is that there's this assumption that if you have a really defined artist identity, you can still be unbiased and you can still appreciate other artist identities. Where it's my lecturer does hip hop, therefore if I do this, then I'm going to get a lower mark. I think that's something, and I think ultimately, I think all of this goes back to the constructivism thing of this assumed, there's an assumed right way that things should be. And it's tough to kind of teach. I mean, what I think is, I don't think there's kind of any absolute truth or absolute way of doing things. But then how do you kind of prepare people for the real world again? Because it requires, when you look at this taxonomy of learning, right? It requires kind of the top level critical thinking to teach that thing of there's nothing that you can possibly learn. So find your way. because they're paying a lot of money, right? They want to be taught something. So I don't know. I've just kind of thrown out a bunch of.
No, I like it. I think
Yeah.
it's really good. Monica, did you? Yeah, sorry. I saw the mic come close, and then
I think the thing that actually it does link entirely to engineering and all kinds of other things. I think for us, the approach that my whole PhD was focused around was the use of a practice diary. So it sounds terrible, right? Okay, so you're told if you're on a performance class, any performance class, so it doesn't matter whether it's individual performance or it's conducting or it's chamber music or it's Chinese students doing MAs in pedagogy and performance or whatever it might be, and all the popular musicians, everyone had to keep a practice diary. Now, they loathed it, okay? So what did you practice today? Oh, I didn't bother to practice. Or very often, first year poppers, absolutely adorable. We went down the pub, we didn't have a session. Great, that's fine, that's real life. But the additional requirement that changed that was that 30% of the module was assessed on a meta-reflective essay that was written. So what have you actually done this year in order to understand your own process of learning as a musician? And that, I even use these things in school, but I also use it with composing projects so that students actually learn to reflect on the process and the challenges and all the rest of it. And the results of that, if you'd watch it for 3 years and say, how do these student musicians develop? By the time they've learned how to use the practice diary properly, they are frighteningly efficient at doing things because they go straight into, and I always used to say to them, look, you've got a 90-page Verdi opera to play. There'll be 10 pages that are completely unplayable. All the rest of it you don't have to worry about. So don't go there. Just look at the unplayable. You don't need the instrument. You can do most of it on the bus or on the train, but with the practice diary, what are you going to do about it? Is this fingering? Is it articulation? Is it breathing? Is it whatever? Yes, if you absolutely have to, play the instrument. But actually, you'll get through like that. And once they've got it, it's absolutely extraordinary because they're then completely self-motivated. They know exactly how much time they need to do that. If they have to have a portfolio life, so it's a lot of it is in music teaching in secondary schools. You're the failed musician, so you went into music teaching because that pays the bill.
Yeah.
But if you've got that practice diary, you can still do a heck of a lot of gigging around the back because you're not wasting time doing the unnecessary. And I look at that approach. If I could get them to do it. I mean, that's, I suppose, why I like the event log as well, because creating an event log when you're working on a DAW requires both critical analysis, but also critical listening to think, well, what did I do with that? And why? And how am I reproducing it? And that, weirdly, is the way you get the critical thinking. And you get the critical listening, and you get the analysis, and you also get a lot of resilience for the weeks where it doesn't get any better. And your practice log keeps telling you it's not getting any better.
You had something to say before.
Wells, can you use your mic?
Technology lecturers, am I right?
Identity. I empathize, and I feel very connected with everybody here that has had that issue because I would flip, going from audio engineer to musician and audio engineer music. I felt like academically speaking, I focused on bass and I practiced and I went and did my recitals and did that stuff. And then I go to my recording and then I'm focusing on the recording, then I'm not playing as much bass and I'm doing a lot of recording. And then 5 years goes down, now I'm doing a lot of bass and I'm not doing a lot of recording. And it's been like this whole career of a whole lot of this and I'm trying desperately to do a little bit of everything to round it out. To keep relevant on everything that I'm doing, and it's really hard. And then when I'm thinking, I'm teaching these young people all these irons in the fire, they should know video editing and building a website and good microphone technique and being a good musician, and it's a little overwhelming. And so it's a process that we have to kind of look forward, and I'm desperately trying not to have a program that was what I did because it was a very mono. This one way. So I think it's always reevaluating, and I think I'm a hesitant academic. I'm very much a practitioner, but
we all do it though, don't we? Like
another T-shirt.
I'm a reluctant academic, but I tell you what, in the last 5 or 6 years of making myself go to conferences and making myself write has just been so important for me.
I've had to do so much internalized work on my identity as somebody who came from industry into academia. And it's, am I there? Well, no, because none of us ever are, because we're layered and flawed. But it's been a real kind of self-reflective process for me to be able to confidently say, I am an academic practitioner. I am a musician with a PhD. And I'm really cool with that. In fact, I'm really proud of it. But oh my days, has it taken some I've been in academia 8 years. It's taken me that to be able to sit here with confidence and to be able to say that. But actually that narrative is super important. And it was so interesting just jumping on what you said about, because we do it. It's such a valuable point. And actually then what happens is our students pick up on that. That was what I was finding, which caused me to write the paper that I did. I'm very conscious of time, and I sort of want to put our panelists on the spot in a nice, kind of friendly, social constructivist kind of way.
Right,
so I'm going to ask a question to each of you, and I'm going to give you guys sort of, loads of time, like 90 seconds to think of the answer. And we want a succinct answer that really draws on your.
Oh, you got the wrong three people for that.
Yeah. But I'm actually going to just discuss it for a few minutes with our lovely audience members. One of the quotes in Monica's paper that I loved, and it was so simple, was a quote from Sam, who said, "We're living in the past." I would like a 1 minute from each of you. Do you think that is true? And if so, how can we not live in the past? And I'm going to discuss it for 2 minutes with our audience members so you can think about it. Are we living in the past, pedagogically? Andrew?
I wonder, is it that we evaluate the current through the vessel of the past?
Nice. For a Saturday afternoon in West London. It's nice. Okay. By the way, this is if we had the answer to this.
I feel like we're actually having class right now.
If we had the answer to this, right, we'd have the think, internalize your thoughts. We'd have the answer to what made great art great. It's that kind. There is no answer to this, but I'm super interested in your thoughts and then your individual thoughts as well. Very good for a Saturday afternoon in West London. Well done, Andy.
So I'm going to be just a bit cheeky and say, if we're living in the past, we have to define the present and the future, and the future just changed about 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And the future is now going 100 times faster than it was 6 months ago. So I'm answering your question with another question.
And that's also okay, because it's 3 and actually I really believe there is no answer. Where I'm trying to get you, what I'm trying to perhaps get myself to think about as well is, if the answer to that is yes, then how do we pedagogically get ourselves and our students and our institutions and our research and our practice out of that dangerous concept? I'm going to take 2 more. So Agata first and the lady behind you, and then I'm coming.
I think looking at the way we still teach classical music, I would say we definitely live in the past. And that makes me sad. But classical music students, first instrument classical music, end up with a useless set of skills after their degrees very often. And they have to seek elsewhere to make themselves employable on their instruments.
Controversial in West London. I love that. I love it. That's what this discussion should be, with some food for thought. If you could just pass the mic, thank you.
Just a cheeky final answer. I'm living in the moment, and I hope my students are too.
Excellent answer. Okay, I'm going to come to our panel. The question is, or the quote was, "We're living in the past." Dr. Daniel Pratt, are we?
I will. A lot of the time I think about pragmatic sense-making theory. How do we make sense of things, and how do we understand things? Carl Weick, 1996, would argue that every time we step out of the flow of existence and look back upon things retrospectively, we are doing the only thing we can possibly do. We're not in the present, we're already past the present, we're not in the future yet. So the present and the future don't exist. Thus meaning, no matter the acceleration or not, that we're really looking at the past and guessing about the future. Meaning that if we want to think as flexible thinkers, we've really just got to start thinking about, well, how can I use that retrospective analysis to create plausible possibilities rather than searching for correct possibilities?
So yes or no? Are we living in the past?
We have to be.
I like that answer.
We can't
and I loved your
live
quote,
any other way.
I'm going to write that down.
Yeah.
Amazing. Monica, we're living in the past.
So we can't escape the past. However, we can always be curious about the process, and that curiosity combined with a very open mind and a focus on our students should lead us to find the new pathways we need.
So are we living in the past, even though we shouldn't be?
Yine.
Yeah. Interesting. And finally,
What did you say? I'm sorry, what did you say?
Just then,
Yeah.
yine.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. We're living in the past. Yeah, you know, I strive to look forward and read and do new things, and but when it comes to the lesson or whatever we're doing, those foundational concepts are from the past, and so I try to figure out how I can do it without staying there as quickly as possible and make it as relevant as possible, as quickly as possible.
I've loved talking with you all. Dan, Monica, Wells, thank you so much for your time and expertise and your brilliant papers, and thank you for stepping in at the last minute. And it's thank you very much to Laura for her glorious paper. I'm very, very sorry that she couldn't be here today, and look forward to seeing her another time. Thank you all very much for coming to this session. I think it's engaged some really interesting. I'm going to go away and be more internalized on many levels. And it's time for coffee.
So there's whatever's left over will be down here. 'Cause we tried to keep the price down as much as possible, so we ran out of afternoon tea money. But if we didn't consume it at lunch, it's probably still there. The final whether you should eat it is your decision.
So are we living in the past?
Yes, right? I was going to make some comment like that, and I was like, no, forget it, let it go.
The only other thing to remember is we are in a different room for the final session. So please, at some point, Liz, Simon, and I will start making hand gestures and trying to Pied Piper everyone down to the opposite end of the university for the final session. And please, can we just give a really big, I'll do it in the big session, but round of applause to our live team.